All right, if you have a Bible with you, would you open up to the book of Exodus? Exodus 20. I want you to hold your place there. And then I want you to open up to Ephesians chapter 6. Ephesians chapter 6. We're going to finish our series this morning entitled A Culture of Honor. And I mentioned last week that you can look at the scope of a calendar and you can find all of these holidays and things that are specific days throughout the year. And every year there are two holidays on the calendar that consistently show up: Mother's and Father's Day. And for some, they can be joyous days, but for some, it's one of the most difficult days. And regardless of which one of these groups you find yourself in today, let me be confident in saying this: God sees you. He sees you in your joy and your despair. He gives hope in the midst of your circumstances, and He loves you even when you feel unlovely. He rescues you when you feel like you are drowning. And in the depths of all of your emotions this morning, I want us to pray to the one who sees you. Father God, we come to you. God, we come to you in the midst of all kinds of emotions and circumstances brought to this place this morning by lots of individuals in different seasons of life, experiencing different things. And God, as we just sang, God, I pray that we know and have experienced how great your love is for us. This overwhelming, overflowing love that you have towards us. Lord, may that be the love that we experience this morning. God, as we study the scriptures, as we talk about honoring people this morning, first and foremost, God, we want to honor you. And I pray that you're honored in our time together this morning. Lord, we pray this in your name. Amen. Amen. If you have tracked with us over the last couple of weeks, you know that the first week we talked about honoring our leaders. Last week we talked about honoring our peers. And today, being Mother's Day, maybe you guessed that we're going to talk about honoring parents. And now as I say that, many of you are thinking, man, I wish my kids were in this room, because they need to hear that, right? But before we read the text again and before we dig in this morning, I want us to remember that all of us sitting in this room are kids of someone. We all have parents. Now, some of us are raising kids currently, and when we're doing that, we oftentimes forget that we're kids ourselves. So look at Exodus chapter 20 and verse 12 again. It says, honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving to you. And I think what's interesting here is there's no age that's placed with this command that at some point you age out of obeying that command, right? To honor your father and your mother. And as we walk through this morning, I want us first to see the instructions. The instruction is clear here in the midst of the Ten Commandments. And I don't want to miss this, because I think it lays the groundwork for understanding this particular commandment if you look back at verse 1, Exodus 20. And God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and the fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Many of us would know the Ten Commandments and maybe even be able to recite the Ten Commandments, but I want to draw your attention to make sure that you're aware that the first 4 commandments are about God Himself. Now we quickly, because we're doers, right? We want to do something, and we want to be able to do something and then look back upon what we did, right? And so we'll immediately jump to the last 6 commandments, because then I can see an outward standard of, yes, I've obeyed those things. But without the first 4 commands, I think if we follow the others, it'll be for the wrong motives. Because the first 4 commands and instructions that the Lord gives is about our relationship and our interaction between creature and God, the Creator. And we need to know that. So when you think about this 5th commandment here, to honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving to you. Isn't it interesting that when you become parents, there's all of these resources, right? Parenting 101. What to expect when you're expecting, right? Here's the textbook on parenting, right? And they're all correct, right? If you get one of them, you're not going to go wrong, right? That was a joke, guys. It was a joke, okay? It was a joke, because the best piece of advice that you'll get is eventually you'll get it, right? You're just kind of learning as you're going. But isn't it interesting that nobody gets a book about Kids 101? Here's how to be a kid. Like, as a kid, you're growing up learning things on the fly. Kind of sounds like parenting, right? You're learning on the fly. Every kid and parent is different. The interaction is different. And so if we go to all of these other resources looking for all of the answers, I think we're going to fall short, because the instructions here are the most important instructions. To have no other gods before God Himself. To not have any idols that we bow down and worship. To not take the Lord's name in vain. To remember the Sabbath day, because we need to rest. And when we're in right relationship there, I think we can rightly follow the 5th commandment, to honor your father and your mother. And this is the commandment, this is the first commandment that's tied to a promise. Because God says, honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving to you. And some of us are thinking, I really want a piece of land, but God's not giving it to me. You have to know the first readers and the first audience, right? God is giving the law here, the 10 Commandments, to Moses to give to the people of Israel, those who have been rescued out of slavery in Egypt, which is why Exodus 20 verse 1 says, and God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. That's the first audience here. So when he talks about the land, it's the promised land that he's going to give to the people of God, to the Israelites, the land of Canaan. If you keep reading in the Old Testament, you'll see that that promise doesn't become a reality until the next generation. See, Numbers 20 and verse 12, God tells Moses, you're not going to lead the people into the promised land. Why? Because you didn't obey me. I told you to do something very specific, and you did it a different way. You're not going to lead the people into the promised land. Deuteronomy chapter 1 in verses 35 and 36 tells us that not one person of this evil generation, except for Joshua and Caleb, will enter into the promised land. So yes, this commandment is tied to a promise, but that promise is delayed until the next generation for the people of Israel. Yet the command to honor your father and mother doesn't go away. The promise is just realized a little bit later. So the fifth commandment here, to honor your father and your mother. As children, honor your parents. But what about the parents? That's why I wanted you to go to Ephesians chapter 6, because there's instructions here for the parents. Ephesians chapter 6 begins, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. And then the Apostle Paul quotes Exodus 20 here, honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. Verse 4, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. So not only are we as children to honor our father and our mother, but as parents, we are to not provoke our children to anger, but instead bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. So God lays out clear instructions when he talks about parents and how children are to relate to their parents and parents are to relate to their children. If you go back to Deuteronomy chapter 6, it tells us that parents are to diligently teach the commands of God to their children. All the time. The text says to do it while you're lying down, to do it while you're sitting up, to do it while you're walking, to nail it to the doorpost of your house. We should always be raising and parenting in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. So I think when we read the scriptures, the instructions are clear. As children, we're to honor our father and mother. As parents, we're to raise our children in discipline and instruction of the Lord. So, stating the obvious, I think these commands show that there's a relationship between parents and children. Can we agree with that? There's some sort of relationship here, right? There's parents and there's kids. Now, how we relate looks very different in all of our family settings. But there is a relationship, and let me be clear here, that this relationship between father and children, between parents and kids, is supposed to represent the relationship between God and his people, not the other way around. You see, what happens is that some of us have had really bad relational experiences with our kids or our parents. We can all agree on that. At some level, maybe it's just for a moment, maybe it's been a longer season, maybe some of us currently have no existing relationship with kids or our parents. Because of sin, Relationships have been broken. It becomes really difficult. It's not a natural thing to relate with people. And it's not a natural thing, listen to me, it's not a natural thing for us to obey. Which is why it's so difficult for us to look at a command that seems so simple, yet we struggle to obey it. And what happens is, because of our bad experiences with our parents, with our kids, we now look at that experience and that relationship or lack thereof and say, that's how God relates to us. Listen, because of sin, the earthly relationships that we see between father and kids, between mother and kids, between parents, husband and wife, all of those relationships are broken because of sin. So they don't perfectly represent the relationship that God intends to have with us. So I understand and have heard several times and deal with often people coming and saying, I can't see God as Father because I don't have a relationship with my dad. Because we think that the relationship that we've experienced with our earthly dad is the way that God relates to us. And the reality is that God is never going to leave us or forsake us. God is always going to love us even when we're unlovable. God is going to love us even when we rebel. Some of us, maybe we know the story of the prodigal son that we see in Luke 15. And the son has taken the inheritance from his dad, the younger son. And essentially in that culture has said, Dad, I want my inheritance now. I wish you were dead. Give me my inheritance now. And he goes and he squanders it and then eventually comes home. And the father runs to him. Listen, that's the relationship that God has with us. Even in our rebellion, even in our sin, God loved us and went to the cross and died in our place to buy us back. Not because we're lovely, but because He's perfect. So I don't want to minimize or dismiss bad relationships. I understand that it's happened. I'm a product of that. Relationships don't always go well, right? People hurt people. And if you've been hurt before, you're more likely to hurt other people because you're hurting out of your hurt. But God is perfect. God is perfect. God is the one that has set the standard and the model, which is why when you read those first 4 commandments in the law, it talks about God and His relationship to His people. God is perfect. God is the one that we should be looking at for standard and now modeling our relationships after Him. Not experiencing relationships here, oftentimes bad relationships, and self-imposing them on God. That's not how God works. That's not who God is. So don't misunderstand the design. But because of sin, our relationships are broken. Because of sin, we rebel. Because of sin, we disrespect. Because of sin, we fight against authority. Right? All of us, I'm sure, can think of a moment where you disobeyed your parents. You did something that you weren't supposed to. Right? They blatantly told you, don't do this, you did it anyway, right? And some of that for us is the rebellion even inside of us. If somebody tells me I can't do something, what do I want to do? The thing that they told me not to do. Here's an example of how I think this happens poorly in our culture. This is a ball of yarn, okay? Some of you in the room, let me be clear, I'm not going to start knitting, okay? But I borrowed this from Mackenzie this morning because I thought it would help. If you think about this ball of yarn being the course of your life, as children, all of that is balled up together, right? And I think what happens is, and you know this because maybe you experienced it in your own upbringing, you've seen other people do it recently, or maybe you're the one who's doing it. Sometimes we can be what's called helicopter parents. Or I think now the term is hovering, okay? So here's your kid, and I'm just going to hover, right? Because I don't want them to get too far out of my sight. Because if they get too far away, what happens? They do things they're not supposed to, right? But here's the way that I think God has designed our relationships between kids and parents, is that God has entrusted us with children, and He's given us another life to be responsible for. And over the course of the life of our children, we should, as they mature, give them more rope. But what oftentimes happens, this was my experience, is that we never loosen the rope. It stays bound up, and then when they become adults, we unleash them. And do you know what happens when kids who haven't experienced certain things in a slow way? They oftentimes get devoured. Sometimes they don't respond well. Well, how can we expect them to respond well if they've never been taught how to respond in those certain situations, right? We need to let go of a little bit of rope at a time, okay? But don't be a helicopter parent where you let go of some of the rope and you just dangle right over them, okay? Like, I still got you tied, okay? Because it needs to be a horizontal distance. Because I think all of us in this room would agree, if we are parents and have children living in our house, we want it to be a horizontal distance, because when they're 30, we don't want them living in the basement. Right? We still want to have a relationship, but we don't want to dangle them and just move them down a floor. We still need to have a relationship. And that happens as we're maturing as children of God, and they're maturing as our children, and Lord willing, we're responding to our responsibility, parenting them in the discipline and instruction of the Lord, so that they will be raised up as God-fearing children of God who will understand that and one day parent and shepherd their own children. But here's the truth of the whole thing. Honoring your parents looks different as seasons change. Honoring your parents looks different as seasons change. Listen, I don't live in my parents' house currently, and I'm thankful for that. And my parents are coming in today and are going to visit for the next couple of days. I don't live with them, and they don't live with me. That's a good thing. Okay? Some of us, because of relationships that we have, that may be an okay thing, right? We may have better relationships with our parents. We may have better relationships with our children, but what we have to understand, okay, go back to the rope, it's going to have to change as seasons change. Because from birth to adolescence, children are dependent on their parents. They can't survive on their own. But a newborn baby and a 5-year-old have a different level of dependence on their parents, right? Now, some of us, when we get to the 5-year-old, it's like, maybe I gave you too much dependence already, right? Like, I thought you could handle brushing your teeth, but I don't think you can, right? Like, we understand all of that, okay? It's a learning thing. Here's one of the problems that I think our culture has experienced, is that we've taken adolescence and extended it. So now in our culture, it's accepted that if you're in your early to mid-20s to still be an adolescent. And so people don't know how to function within our culture. I think we need to dial it back in and understand truly that adolescence is this young, kind of just before preteen and overlap into preteen, maybe early teenage, okay? But once they're later in their teens, moving into their early 20s, they're young adults. So birth to adolescence, they're dependent on their parents, but adolescence to young adults needs to be guided responsibility. That's when we're letting go of a little bit of rope. We're still guiding them, right? Here's my belief. We, as human beings, have forgotten what it's like to fail. We've forgotten what it's like to fail because we grew up with someone always swooping in to rescue us before we failed. And sometimes we need to experience failure, but in the right way, in a guided, responsible way, right? And when we fail, because all of us as adults, we're all failing, right? There's something. If it's just sheerly obeying all of God's commandments, we're struggling daily. I'm struggling daily. So if we're failing, we need to fail forward. Not failing backwards because we're running away, but we're striving to follow Jesus more deeply. And so when we do fail, because we will, because sin is still present around us, we need to fail forward. Let your kids do that. Let them fail forward. If your kids are starting to crawl or to walk or maybe even starting to run, I say this a little bit jokingly, they bounce, okay? They bounce. They're a little bit more flexible at that young age than we are as adults, right? And they recover a little bit more quickly. But some of us are so scared to let our kids fall. How's that played out? Well, some of you experience the same thing. When I went to recess in elementary school, we had competitions to see who could swing the highest and jump out of the swing onto asphalt, not recycled rubber. Okay? Girls got their hair caught in the chain because there was no rubber coating over the chain of the swing, right? Sometimes we got to learn, oh, that hurts. That was dumb. I shouldn't do that, right? I can't fly. You shouldn't jump off the roof. Okay? Thankfully, I never did that. I watched my friend do that, and I didn't stop him. We need to learn how to fail and fail forward, okay? Failure is not always a bad thing because I think in that failure, that's when God is refining us and He's shaping us, okay? Don't go out with the intention of, all right, I'm going to see how many commandments I can break today, right? But naturally, because of our sin nature, we're going to fail. We're going to disobey God's commands. But if we're failing forward in guided responsibility, I think that we'll recover. So eventually they get to young adult. And between young adult and adult seasons, I think there needs to be advised responsibility. Okay? We're not guiding them. We're not telling them what they need to do. But hopefully we have a relationship with our kids that even as young adult children, they have a relationship with us where they'll come back and say, hey, I need your advice on this. And then that last season of life, from adult to death, and understand there's some overlap in these, okay, these aren't like cookie cutter categories, right? There's some overlap. In that last season of life, from adulthood to death, we're responsible for others. Because now as children, we're adults and we're guiding and advising our own children, right? But we also get to a level where we start caring for our parents, or we start having to care for our spouse. And so the season looks different, right? It looks different to honor your parents when you're an 8-year-old kid and you live in their house and they provide everything for you, and you're a 58-year-old adult who's now caring for your aging father who can't provide for himself. That season is different. And it looks different to honor your parents in that. So as these seasons change, I think that we can be intentional. And here's how. Here's the application as to how we can be intentional to honor our parents. I think the first is that we need to, as parents ourselves, we need to observe and study our kids. We need to observe and study our kids. Listen, our kids are tiny humans. Okay? They're people. They have personalities, they have likes, they have dislikes, right? I know when they're young, you just want them to eat their vegetables. But they may legitimately not like peas. And that's okay. But we have to observe and study that, right? I think one of the most difficult things that we've faced as parents is getting to the point where our kids don't all like the same thing. Like, it was really easy when they were all little and we just watch a movie. Now they're older and they all want to watch a different movie. But we have to observe and study our kids to have relationship with them. If you have kids living in your home, you know that you parent all of them differently, right? Let me say this right here in the application, because I don't want you to think that I'm dismissing it, because I think there's another thing at play here. In observing and studying your kids, you may need to come to the realization that in that particular season of life, you need another adult who can speak truth into their life. And let me tell you that transition is difficult when you move from them being totally dependent on you to a guiding, responsible season. Because you want to be everything that they need, right? And that's okay. But there's going to come a time when you can't give them everything that they need. And I think the mark of humility in us as parents is seeing that our kids need a relationship with another believing adult. They need someone else to speak truth into their life. And let me tell you, if you don't have kids living in your home for whatever reason, your kids have grown and they're no longer living in your home, the Lord has seen different ways for you to parent. Maybe you're a step parent, maybe you're an adoptive parent, maybe you're a fostering parent, maybe God hasn't blessed you with physical children and He's called you to be a spiritual mother or father. This is where you guys step in and love and care for the kids that are in your sphere of influence. Whether it's the kids in your neighborhood, it's other kids in your family, maybe it's nephews and nieces, maybe it's kids in the school community, maybe it's co-workers' kids, maybe it's kids within the church where you guys step in and help in those seasons. I think the second application is this, and this is posed to be difficult in my situation, because I came to the realization that what I desired in a relationship with my parents was not the same thing that they desired. But I think the healthy thing at some point is to build a friendship with your parents. And that happens through that slow giving of rope. Is that the relationship begins to change from just parent to child Now it's guiding in responsibility. It's advising in responsibility. And now, when they don't live in your home, you're now just adults, right? And so building a relationship with them. And I understand that there are circumstances where we don't have relationships with our parents. Maybe it's because you were adopted and you've never known your parents. Maybe, unfortunately, you lost a parent early. But I think it's worthwhile to build a friendship with your parents. Because if the only relationship that you have with your parents is parent to child, then when you move out of their house, it becomes a check mark and that relationship no longer exists. And I think many of us want that relationship to continue because eventually we hope that they become grandparents, right? And then it becomes difficult for them to relate as grandparents to their grandkids if they don't have a relationship with their own kids, who are the parents of their grandkids. Lastly, let me say this in application. Make memories. Make memories, okay? Some of those memories may be some of those failing moments, right? There's a failure, and that just becomes this really strong memory that you recall in your life because it was handled in an appropriate way, that it becomes this lasting mark that influences where your relationship is at. But I think we have to make memories. I think we have to do things together. And this goes back to observing and studying your kids, because eventually your kids are going to like different things. And sometimes they're going to have different personalities than you. They're going to like different things than you like. So it may be a stretch. So let me encourage you to take risk in making memories with your kids. It may not be something that you choose to do, that you would, if given the option, I'm going to go with that. It may not be that. It may be totally out of your comfort zone, but it may be a lasting memory that your kid will never forget. Make memories with your kids who are living in your home. Make memories with the kids that are living outside of your home, whether it's your grown children or it's children that you're spiritually parenting, as you have a relationship with their parents and you're helping to speak truth into their lives. Or maybe it's making memories with your parents now. I think it's vitally important in honoring our parents to remember last week's take-home truth. That in the Christian life, we need deep relationships. And some of those deep relationships will be relationships that we have with kids and relationships that we have with our parents. And sometimes it may be the relationships that we have together right here in this flock that allow the opportunity in a season where we need it for another individual to step in and help shepherd and guide the heart of your child. Let's pray.